My name is Dulce Whitford. I'm 28 years old. For most of my life, my parents treated me like the defective child while my sister Miranda collected Ivy League degrees and promises about someday taking over the family empire. They joked about my dyslexia during dinners, left me out of important decisions, and paid me barely enough to survive while Miranda received salaries and bonuses large enough to buy apartments in Manhattan. But on the afternoon of Miranda's graduation celebration at the Plaza Hotel, with more than 300 guests filling the ballroom in black tuxedos and designer gowns, a stranger stepped beside me and placed a thick envelope into my hands. Inside were documents that would destroy every lie my parents had spent 20 years building around me. What they never realized was that Grandma had been watching all along. She saw every insult, every humiliation, every quiet act of cruelty they thought nobody noticed. And before she died, she left behind something powerful enough to shake the entire Whitford empire to its foundation. The Whitfords were old Manhattan wealth, the kind of family whose surname appeared on hospital buildings, museum plaques, and charity galas. My father, Gerald Whitford, ran Whitford Properties, a commercial real estate empire my grandmother, Ella Lehner, had built from a tiny Brooklyn office back in 1965. By 2024, the company was worth $92 million. I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 7 years old. Words never stayed still for me. Letters blurred together, shifted positions, and turned ordinary sentences into puzzles that took me 3 times longer to understand than everyone else. My parents didn't react with patience or support. They reacted with embarrassment. When I was 12, they hired elite tutors for Miranda. She had violin lessons through Juilliard programs, French immersion classes, and SAT coaching with a Princeton graduate who charged $400 an hour. One evening, I asked if I could get extra help with reading too. My mother, Priscilla, barely looked up before sighing heavily. "Dulce, we've already spent enough on specialists. At some point, we have to accept that some children simply aren't academic." I was 12 years old, and I believed her. So I stopped asking for help. Instead, I figured out my own way to survive. Audiobooks became my escape. I built systems using diagrams, color coding, sketches, and visual maps that helped me process information in ways traditional reading never could. And every Sunday afternoon, I rode the train to my grandmother Ella Lehner's apartment on the Upper West Side, where she sat with me for hours explaining difficult ideas through stories instead of textbooks. "Dooley," she told me once, resting her weathered hand gently over mine, "you may read slower than most people, but you notice things they never see. That's not weakness, sweetheart. That's a different kind of intelligence." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Eventually I would. But before that happened, I still had nearly 2 more decades of being treated like the Whitford family's private disappointment. Christmas dinner in 2018 brought 20 relatives together inside my parents' Upper East Side townhouse. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished silverware and catered food while everyone performed the usual yearly tradition of pretending the Whitfords were perfect. Halfway through dinner, my father rose from his chair and lifted a glass of wine. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, his voice carrying the same polished authority he used in board meetings. "Miranda has officially been accepted into Harvard Law School on a full scholarship." The room exploded into applause. Relatives cheered. Miranda smiled modestly like she had practiced the reaction beforehand. "My eldest daughter," Gerald continued proudly, "will be the first Whitford in 3 generations to attend Harvard. She's going to lead this family and this company into an extraordinary future." More applause followed. Uncle Richard clapped Miranda on the shoulder while Aunt Catherine wiped tears from her eyes with a linen napkin. Then my father's attention drifted toward me at the far end of the table. "And Dully," he paused just long enough for the room to grow awkwardly quiet. The warmth disappeared from his expression. "Well, Dully is here too." A few relatives laughed softly. Not loudly enough to seem cruel. Just enough to sting. Miranda laughed with them. I stared down at my plate while the roasted lamb blurred through the tears gathering in my eyes. I refused to let them fall. Then beneath the tablecloth, someone reached for my hand. Thin fingers. Fragile skin. Grandma Ella Laner. She squeezed my hand gently from across the table. When I looked up, there was something burning in her eyes. Not pity. Anger. The kind directed at her own son. She didn't say anything that night. But 3 months later, she called and asked me to come to her apartment because there was something important she needed to show me. At the time, I had no idea that Christmas dinner, that single moment of humiliation in front of 20 relatives, had already started something irreversible. Something that would spend the next 5 years quietly building toward an explosion capable of tearing the entire Whitford family apart. After graduating from a state university in 2022, not an Ivy League school, never anything prestigious enough for my parents to brag about, I applied for a position at Whitford Properties. I wanted to prove I could still contribute to the family business, that there was a place for me somewhere inside the company my grandmother had spent her life building. My father agreed to hire me as an administrative assistant. Salary, $42,000 a year. That same month, Miranda joined the company as chief legal counsel. Her starting compensation package included a $280,000 salary, annual bonuses, and stock incentives. My responsibilities involved photocopying contracts, scheduling conference rooms, organizing expense reports, and bringing coffee to executives who rarely remembered my name. I wasn't invited into meetings. Nobody explained deals to me. Nobody trusted me with anything important. But I watched. And I listened. Over time, I discovered something unexpected about myself during those endless hours in the copy room. I could recognize patterns other people overlooked. When executives discussed projects in hallways, I'd quietly sketch diagrams showing relationships between investors, shell companies, lenders, and properties. I mapped the movement of money, tracked hidden partnerships, and noticed conflicts no one else seemed to catch. The strange visual systems I'd created to survive dyslexia had evolved into something sharper. Something useful. Grandma Ella Laner had noticed it long before anyone else. During those Sunday afternoons in her apartment, she would spread old company contracts across the dining room table and teach me how to understand them, not line by line like lawyers did, but structurally. Like systems. Like architecture. Your father reads contracts like a man searching for leverage, she told me once in 2019, shortly before her health began failing. He looks for advantage. You read differently, Dooley. You see how everything connects. That same afternoon, she handed me a small mahogany box with brass hinges worn dull with age. Keep this somewhere safe, she said quietly. Don't open it yet. When the time comes, you'll know. I remember turning the box over in my hands, confused by the seriousness in her voice. But I took it home, placed it in the back of my closet, and tried not to think about it again. March 2019. Grandma Ella Laner was 82 years old then. Her body had weakened, her silver hair grown thin against the cushions of her favorite armchair, but her eyes still carried the same sharp intelligence that had built an empire from nothing. Sit down, Dooley, she said softly. I sat across from her in the living room where we'd spent hundreds of Sunday afternoons together. The walls were lined with photographs documenting decades of her life. Ella Laner standing beside the first apartment building she purchased in Brooklyn in 1965. Ella Laner shaking hands with the mayor during a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Ella Laner receiving a Women in Business award in the late 1980s. What struck me most was what the photographs didn't show. My father barely appeared in any of them. I built Whitford Properties from nothing, she said, looking around the room. One office. One secretary. 60 years of work. Then her expression hardened slightly. Your father inherited it. He never built anything himself. And because of that, he doesn't understand what it actually costs to create something. I stayed quiet. He judges people by schools, titles, credentials, she continued. He mistakes polish for character. Then she leaned toward me. I judge people by how they treat those with less power than they have. Her eyes locked onto mine. And you, Dulce, are the only person in this family who understands kindness. She placed the wooden box into my hands again. There's something inside that may help you one day, she said carefully. But not yet. You're not ready for it yet. Her fingers tightened around mine. And neither is Gerald. I wanted to ask what she meant. I wanted to know what was inside the box, why she had chosen me, why she sounded almost afraid. But just as quickly as the conversation had turned serious, she changed the subject entirely. She started talking about the weather, her roses on the balcony, a mystery novel she had been reading. 18 months later, she was dead. Pancreatic cancer. I sat beside her bed in hospice holding her hand while the machines beeped softly around us. None of my relatives stayed long. Miranda visited once for less than 20 minutes because she had meetings. My father spent more time taking phone calls in the hallway than sitting with his mother. I was there when she took her final breath. After the funeral, the box stayed untouched in the back of my closet. April 2024. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Subject line, Position Restructuring, Confidential. I opened it slowly, already feeling dread settling into my stomach. Dear Ms. Whitford. As part of our ongoing organizational optimization efforts, your current position will be eliminated effective July 1, 2024. Human Resources will contact you regarding severance arrangements. I read the message 3 separate times while the letters blurred and shifted across the screen before finally settling back into the same devastating sentence. They were firing me. That evening, I stayed late pretending to organize files no one would probably ever open again. Through the thin wall separating my cubicle from my father's corner office, I heard voices carrying through the silence. Gerald and Priscilla. We can't keep her here once Miranda takes over, my father said. It looks ridiculous. The CEO's sister working as a glorified secretary? People will start asking questions. What kind of questions? My father asked. Why she's never been promoted. Why she's still answering phones while Miranda prepares to run the company. A long pause followed. Then my mother answered quietly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. We've done everything we could for her, Gerald. Some children simply don't have the capacity for more. Exactly, my father replied. Which is why she needs to leave. We'll give her a decent severance package and help her transition somewhere else. Somewhere better suited to her limitations. I stood frozen beside the wall separating my cubicle from his office, one hand pressed flat against the plaster. $42,000 a year. My share of a tiny studio apartment in Queens cost $1,800 every month. I had no savings. No backup plan. No family safety net waiting to catch me. If I lost this job, I'd run out of money within weeks. But the fear tightening my chest wasn't really about finances. It was the realization settling deep inside me like ice. If I accepted their version of me, if I allowed them to define me as incapable for the rest of my life, then I would remain the family failure forever. Not because I lacked intelligence. Not because I couldn't succeed. But because nobody had ever truly allowed me the opportunity to try. Miranda's graduation party was the next evening. I found myself wondering what other announcements my father had planned. May 15, 2024. The Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom. 350 guests filled the enormous gilded room. Investors, attorneys from elite Manhattan firms, business partners, politicians, and relatives I barely recognized moved between crystal chandeliers and tables covered in white silk linens. A 12-piece orchestra played Gershwin near the stage while servers carried trays of champagne through the crowd. This was Gerald Whitford's natural habitat. His kingdom. The place where he performed the role he loved most, powerful businessman, respected patriarch, self-made success story. I stood near the entrance tugging nervously at the hem of my dress. Simple black fabric. $79 from Zara. The most expensive thing I owned. Everywhere around me shimmered designer labels, diamond jewelry, and tailored tuxedos that probably cost more than my yearly rent. Before I could search for my seat, my mother intercepted me. Dulce. Priscilla's eyes swept over me from head to toe, lingering briefly on my worn heels and cheap makeup. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the nicest thing you could find? It's what I could afford, I answered quietly. Well. She adjusted the diamond bracelet around her wrist. You're seated at table 27 near the service entrance. Try not to draw unnecessary attention to yourself. Of course. She started to walk away, then stopped. And Dulce, she said softly, leaning closer. The heavy scent of Chanel perfume surrounded me. Tonight is about Miranda. Whatever bitterness you're carrying around, keep it hidden. Do not embarrass this family. Then she disappeared back into the crowd before I could respond. Table 27 sat at the very back of the ballroom, partially blocked by a marble pillar with a clear view of the catering doors swinging open and shut. My tablemates were distant relatives I'd met only once or twice before. From my seat, I could see the massive portrait of Miranda displayed beside the stage, smiling confidently in Harvard graduation robes beneath a gold banner that read, "Congratulations, Miranda Whitford. Harvard Law Class of 2024. And near the ballroom entrance stood a silver-haired man in a gray suit. He wasn't drinking. Wasn't socializing. Wasn't speaking to anyone. He simply watched the room quietly. At one point, his eyes met mine across the crowd. A strange chill crawled down my spine. At exactly 8:30 p.m., the orchestra stopped playing. The lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the stage where my father stood holding a champagne flute. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gerald announced smoothly, "thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate an extraordinary young woman." Applause erupted immediately. Miranda graduated in the top 5% of her class at Harvard Law School. She completed a prestigious clerkship under Justice Reynolds. And last month, she was placed on partner track at Sullivan and Cromwell in record time. The crowd murmured with admiration. My father's face glowed with pride. But tonight, he continued, I'm not only celebrating Miranda's accomplishments. Tonight, I'm announcing her future. Miranda stepped onto the stage beside him wearing an emerald green Valentino gown that probably cost more than my annual salary. Effective immediately, my father declared, Miranda Whitford will inherit my full estate upon my passing. Another wave of applause crashed through the ballroom. This includes our Park Avenue residence currently valued at $13 million, our family investment portfolio, multiple luxury properties, and, most importantly, control of Whitford properties when I retire. The room exploded into a standing ovation. Camera flashes lit the ballroom like lightning. Miranda pressed her fingertips beneath her eyes, pretending to fight back tears while smiling perfectly for the photographers. 350 people celebrating her future. Not one of them looked toward table 27. Beside me, one of my distant cousins leaned closer. I vaguely remembered meeting her years earlier at a funeral. Dooley, right, she asked carefully. So, what happens to you? I opened my mouth. Then closed it again. Because I honestly had no answer. What was I supposed to say? That my own family had just erased me in front of hundreds of people? That the termination notice sitting in my inbox was only the beginning? That every terrible thing I'd secretly believed about myself since childhood had just been confirmed publicly by the people whose approval I'd spent my entire life chasing? The applause eventually faded. Miranda embraced our father on stage while photographers crowded closer, flashes exploding across the ballroom. And through the blur of moving guests, I noticed the silver-haired man near the entrance begin walking toward me. Slowly. Calmly. Like he had been waiting for this exact moment all evening. He stopped beside table 27. Up close, I realized he was older than I first thought, probably early 60s, with tired eyes and the careful posture of someone who had spent decades inside courtrooms and boardrooms. Miss Whitford. I straightened slightly in my chair. Yes? My name is Jonathan Ellis. He reached into his jacket and handed me a cream-colored business card embossed with elegant lettering. Morrison and Blake. Attorneys at law. I was your grandmother's attorney. For a second, my brain stalled completely. My grandmother? Ella Laner Whitford, he confirmed quietly. She left instructions for me several years ago regarding this evening. My pulse stumbled. She died 3 years ago. I'm aware. His expression remained professional, unreadable. Before her death, she entrusted me with something intended specifically for you. From inside his jacket, he removed a thick cream envelope sealed with dark red wax stamped by a notary seal. What is this? I whispered. Your grandmother's will. I stared at him blankly. The real one, he added softly. The version your father doesn't know exists. The room suddenly felt too warm. Too loud. I looked down at the envelope in my trembling hands. The notary stamp carried a date. September 12, 2019. 5 months after the afternoon Grandma had handed me the wooden box in her apartment. I don't understand, I said. Your grandmother left very specific instructions, Ellis replied. I was to deliver this document only after Gerald publicly excluded you from the family legacy. His eyes flicked briefly toward the stage where my father and Miranda still stood surrounded by applause and admiration. I believe that requirement has now been satisfied. My fingers tightened around the envelope. What's inside? For the first time, his expression softened slightly. Mrs. Whitford told me to say this to you. He paused. Give this to Dulce on the day Gerald finally shows her who he truly is. By then, she'll be ready. Then he adjusted his tie and stepped backward. You'll likely have questions after reading it. My contact information is on the card. And just like that, he disappeared back into the crowd. I couldn't breathe inside that ballroom anymore. I slipped through the service entrance and wandered into an empty hallway near the hotel kitchens where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the celebration became nothing more than a muffled echo behind closed doors. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal. Inside sat 3 pages of dense legal text. A notarized signature. The same date from 2019. I forced myself to read slowly despite the familiar blur of letters shifting on the page. I, Ella Laner Margaret Whitford, being of sound mind and legal capacity, hereby revoke all prior testamentary documents and declare this to be my final will and testament. My eyes moved farther down until one paragraph stopped me cold. To my granddaughter, Dulce and Whitford, I leave 51% ownership of my shares in Whitford Properties LLC, presently valued at approximately $47 million. Including all associated voting authority and controlling interest. I stopped breathing. Then read the sentence again. And again. 51%. Controlling ownership. The words barely felt real. Further down the page, another paragraph caught my attention. This decision is made with full understanding of my son Gerald Whitford's treatment of Dulce throughout her life. She has been excluded, underestimated, and denied opportunity not because she lacked ability, but because she lacked support. My vision blurred. Dulce is not incapable. Dulce was neglected. I will not allow Gerald's prejudice to continue controlling her future after my death. A broken sound escaped my throat before I could stop it. Grandma knew. She had known the entire time. Every insult. Every dismissal. Every moment I'd spent believing something was fundamentally wrong with me. She had seen all of it. Then I reached the final clause. Condition of execution. Dulce and Whitford must formally request an emergency meeting of the Whitford Properties Board of Directors within 72 hours of receiving this document. Failure to act within that period will void this amendment, and all assets shall transfer according to the 2015 will currently on file. 72 hours. I checked the time instinctively. The deadline would expire at exactly 8:30 p.m. on May 18th. I leaned against the cold hallway wall, gripping the pages tightly against my chest. My grandmother had spent years preparing this moment. She had handed me power powerful enough to destroy everything my father thought he controlled. Now I had to decide whether I was brave enough to use it. When I finally stepped back into the lobby, Jonathan Ellis was waiting quietly near the coat check counter. "You've read it," he said immediately. "The 72-hour condition," I whispered. "Why would she do that?" Ellis studied me carefully for a moment before reaching into his pocket and handing me a second business card. "Because your grandmother understood something important about you, Miss Whitford." The second card had a handwritten cell phone number scrawled across the back in blue ink. Jonathan Ellis lowered his voice. "Your grandmother understood something about you, Dulce. If she gave you unlimited time, you'd spend months convincing yourself not to act." I stared at him silently. "The deadline wasn't meant to pressure you," he continued. "It was meant to free you. Permission to stop waiting for your family to suddenly recognize your worth. Permission to claim what already belongs to you." He glanced at his watch. "You have until 8:30 p.m. on May 18th. 3 days. If you decide to proceed, we'll need to file a formal request for an emergency board meeting immediately." Through the ballroom doors, I could still see my father standing beneath flashing cameras with Miranda beside him, both of them smiling like royalty. My mother floated through the crowd accepting congratulations from investors and socialites as though Miranda's success somehow belonged to her personally. If I moved forward with this, everything would shatter. My parents would never forgive me. Miranda would call it betrayal. The family would paint me as greedy, unstable, vindictive. But if I stayed silent, then they won. I would spend the rest of my life carrying the identity they'd built for me. The slow daughter. The disappointing daughter. The daughter who didn't matter enough to inherit anything at all. "Miss Whitford." Ellis's voice interrupted the spiral in my head. "Your grandmother spent the last years of her life preparing for this moment because she believed in you completely." He held my gaze steadily. "The real question is whether you believe in yourself." I looked down at the will in my hands. At Ella Laner's signature. The woman who had held my hand beneath holiday tables while everyone else laughed. The woman who taught me to read contracts like blueprints instead of paragraphs. The only person who had ever looked at me and seen possibility instead of limitation. I swallowed hard. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said quietly. "We're scheduling the board meeting." For the first time that evening, Jonathan Ellis smiled. "Small. Certain." "She said you would." I'm going to pause the story here for 1 second. If you've ever spent years being underestimated by people who should have believed in you, if you know what it feels like to be dismissed before you've even had a chance to prove yourself, comment the word enough below. Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is realizing you no longer need permission to value yourself. And trust me, what happened inside that boardroom changed everything. Now back to the story. That night, sitting alone in my cramped Queens apartment, I finally opened the wooden box Grandma had given me years earlier. My roommates were asleep. The apartment was silent except for distant traffic outside the window. Orange streetlight spilled across my bed in narrow stripes while the mahogany box rested in my lap. The brass hinges creaked softly as I lifted the lid. Inside were three things. A handwritten letter on Ella Lehner's personal stationery. An old document stamped with a 1965 filing date. And a modern USB drive that looked strangely out of place beside the aged paper. I reached for the letter first. My dearest Dulce. If you're reading this, then Jonathan has fulfilled his promise, and your father has likely done exactly what I feared he would someday do. I'm sorry I could not protect you while I was alive. But perhaps I can still protect you now. The enclosed document is the original partnership agreement created in 1965 when Whitford Properties was founded. Gerald has never seen this version. It establishes that founder shares maintain permanent controlling voting rights which cannot be reduced, diluted, or reassigned without full board approval. The USB contains evidence of something your father hoped time would erase. In March of 2018, Gerald proposed a private resolution to reduce my voting authority from 51% to 10%. Officially, he claimed I was too old to understand modern business practices. In reality, he simply wanted control before I was ready to surrender it. The board rejected his proposal by 2 votes. I was one of them. I never forgot what he tried to do. And I never forgave the way he treated you afterward, as though diminishing you somehow justified replacing me. Use this carefully, Dulce. Not for revenge. For fairness. All my love. Grandma Ella Lehner. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling again. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. One file appeared. board_meeting_minutes_March_2018.pdf. Inside was everything. Official meeting records. Timestamps. Voting results. My father's formal attempt to strip his own mother of power while declaring her mentally outdated. Documented proof. He hadn't inherited integrity from Ella Lehner. He had inherited entitlement. May 16, 9:01 a.m. Margaret Coleman answered on the second ring. Julie Whitford. Her voice carried the rough warmth of someone who had smoked too much, laughed too loudly, and survived long enough to stop apologizing for either. I've been wondering when you'd finally call. I blinked in surprise. You know who I am? A dry chuckle crackled through the phone. Sweetheart, your grandmother and I built half of Brooklyn together back in the 70s. She talked about you constantly. A brief pause followed. Then Margaret's tone softened. She said someday you'd need to learn exactly what kind of woman you really are. Miranda laughed softly. A sharp, polished sound designed to humiliate without ever raising her voice. About what exactly? She asked. You work in the copy room. The nature of my presentation is confidential. She folded her arms. Dooley, you barely know what ROI means. Return on investment, I replied evenly. It's not especially complicated. For the first time that morning, Miranda's perfect expression faltered. Only slightly. But enough. Before she could respond, my father appeared at the far end of the hallway with 2 senior executives trailing behind him. What's happening here? Gerald demanded. Dulce wants to attend the board meeting, Miranda answered smoothly. I was explaining why that isn't possible. My father looked at me the same way he always had, with restrained irritation, as though my existence itself created inconvenience. Dully, he said coldly, go back to your desk. This meeting doesn't concern you. Actually, another voice interrupted from inside the boardroom, it concerns her quite a bit. Margaret Coleman stepped into the doorway. At 72, she carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades negotiating deals with men twice as loud and half as competent. Her silver hair was pinned neatly back, and every person in that hallway immediately fell silent when she spoke. I invited Miss Whitford, Margaret said. She has standing to address the board. Gerald's jaw tightened visibly. Margaret. Let her in. The words weren't loud, but they landed with absolute finality. For a brief moment, I thought my father might physically block the entrance. But Margaret Coleman had served on the board for more than 3 decades. In that room, her authority rivaled his own. Finally, Gerald stepped aside. "Fine," he said, voice sharp as broken glass. "Let her speak. We'll see how long it takes before she humiliates herself." The boardroom felt smaller than I expected. A long oval table made of polished walnut dominated the center of the room, surrounded by 12 leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan while portraits of past executives lined the walls. Above the fireplace hung a painted portrait of Grandma Ella Laner. Her eyes seemed fixed directly on me. 12 board members settled into their seats. Gerald positioned himself at the head of the table with Miranda seated beside him despite not officially holding a board seat yet. The symbolism was obvious. Successor already chosen. I was directed toward a chair near the far end of the table. Not excluded exactly. Just carefully placed as far from power as possible. In the corner of the room sat Jonathan Ellis with his briefcase resting beside him. He caught my eye briefly and nodded once. Robert Hartley, the board chairman and longtime friend of my grandmother, cleared his throat. This emergency session was formally requested by Margaret Coleman, Richard Holloway, and Susan Parker. He glanced around the table. "Margaret, you have the floor." Margaret rose slowly. "Thank you, Robert. I'll keep this brief." She gestured toward me. "The matter before the board concerns a legal document recently brought to light. One that may significantly affect the ownership structure of Whitford Properties." A ripple of attention moved through the room. Margaret turned toward me. "I yield my time to Miss Dulce Whitford." Every eye at the table shifted in my direction. Miranda smirked openly. Gerald leaned back in his chair wearing the expression of a man already bored by something he considered beneath him. I stood slowly. To my surprise, my hands weren't shaking anymore. "Thank you, Mrs. Coleman," I began. "And thank you to the board for allowing me to speak today." I opened the worn leather portfolio in front of me. What I'm about to present may come as a surprise to several people in this room. I'm asking only that everyone review the evidence completely before reaching conclusions. Gerald released a loud, exaggerated sigh. I ignored him and continued reaching for the documents. Then my father raised one hand casually. "Robert, before we waste the board's valuable time, I think some context is necessary." Without waiting for permission, Gerald stood and buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate calm. "Dulce is my daughter," he said warmly, using the same patronizing tone he reserved for difficult clients and charity events. "And naturally, I love her very much. However, she is not qualified to address this board on any serious corporate matter." A few uncomfortable glances passed around the table. "She works in a purely administrative role," Gerald continued. "She has no legal background, no executive training, no strategic experience whatsoever." Miranda leaned forward beside him, her voice coated in false concern. "Dooley also struggles with dyslexia," she added gently. "Reading and processing information has always been difficult for her. We've tried to support her as much as possible, but," she gave a delicate shrug. "Some limitations simply can't be overcome through effort alone." Silence settled heavily over the room. I noticed several board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "What we're witnessing," Gerald continued smoothly, "is likely an emotional reaction to recent family events. The graduation announcement, inheritance discussions, sibling jealousy can be complicated. Mr. Whitford." Robert Hartley's voice cut through the room like a gavel strike. "You will have an opportunity to respond after Miss Whitford finishes speaking." His expression hardened slightly. "She requested this hearing, and she is entitled to it." Gerald sat back down slowly, but the look he gave me carried a promise. Punishment later. Across the table, Miranda met my eyes and silently mouthed the words. You're embarrassing yourself. I looked at both of them, my father and my sister, and for the first time in my entire life, something inside me stopped shrinking. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was something colder. Cleaner. For the first time, I saw the truth clearly. My parents had never been trying to protect me. They weren't even protecting the company. They were protecting a story. A version of reality where I stayed small enough to justify the way they treated me. Thank you, Mr. Hartley, I said calmly. I reached into my portfolio and removed the document. I won't be discussing my reading ability today. I'll be discussing this. I held up the will. The room fell silent instantly. This is the final will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Whitford, founder of Whitford Properties, executed and notarized on September 12, 2019. Across the table, all color drained from Gerald's face. That's impossible, he snapped. His voice sounded strangled now, uneven. My mother's will was finalized in 2015. I personally reviewed it. You reviewed a previous version, I replied evenly. Under New York estate law, a legally executed subsequent will revokes all prior testamentary documents. I placed the papers carefully on the table. This document was executed 4 years after the will currently in your possession. Then I turned toward Jonathan Ellis. Mr. Ellis, would you please confirm the authenticity of the document? Jonathan stood from the corner of the room and approached the table with measured calm. My name is Jonathan Ellis, senior partner at Morrison & Blake, he said. I served as Eleanor Whitford's personal attorney from 2008 until her death in 2021. He rested one hand lightly against the document. I can confirm this will was executed in my presence on September 12, 2019. It was witnessed by 2 independent notaries, and the original remains secured in escrow with Chase Private Client. Robert Hartley adjusted his glasses and scanned the pages slowly. Then his eyebrows lifted sharply. This will transfers 51% ownership of Whitford Properties to, he looked up directly at me. Miss Dulce Whitford. Murmurs spread around the boardroom immediately. That's fraudulent, Miranda said quickly, but the confidence had vanished from her voice. There's no way Grandma would. It is not fraudulent, Jonathan interrupted firmly. And I would strongly advise against accusations of forgery without evidence, Miss Whitford. His gaze hardened slightly. Morrison & Blake's reputation has survived for over 80 years. We do not fabricate estate documents. Gerald slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. This is ridiculous. My mother was sick. She was vulnerable. Someone manipulated her. Manipulated? I repeated quietly. I reached for my phone. Then perhaps you can explain this. I pressed play. The recording from the March 2018 board meeting filled the room with my father's voice. Eleanor is 81 years old. She doesn't understand modern business operations anymore. I'm proposing her voting authority be reduced to 10%. The audio stopped. Silence crashed down over the room. Gerald's face darkened into a dangerous shade of red. That recording was from a confidential executive session, he snapped. A private discussion. One which Eleanor attended herself, I replied calmly. As majority shareholder, she had every legal right to record it. Robert Hartley slowly removed his reading glasses. His expression had changed completely now. Miss Whitford, he said carefully, would you read the relevant section of the will aloud for the official record? I nodded. For a brief second, the old fear returned. The fear of stumbling over words. Of freezing. Of proving them right. Then I looked up at my grandmother's portrait hanging above the fireplace. And I began reading. To my granddaughter, Dulce and Whitford, I leave 51% ownership of my shares in Whitford Properties LLC, together with all associated voting authority and controlling interest. I paused, allowing the words to settle over the room. This decision is made with full understanding of my son Gerald Whitford's treatment of Dulce. She has been excluded, underestimated, and denied opportunity not because she lacked intelligence, but because she lacked support. Miranda made a small strangled sound beside him. I continued. Dulce is not slow. Dulce was abandoned. And I will not allow her father's prejudice to continue controlling her future after my death. The room was motionless now. I looked directly at Gerald. Gerald confuses credentials with character, I read. He mistakes degrees for worth. He attempted to strip me of authority because I recognized who he had become. He diminished Dulce because she reminded him of the kind of humanity he abandoned long ago. My father said nothing. For the first time in my life, I noticed his hands trembling. I read the final lines carefully. I built this company from nothing. I alone decide who carries it forward. I choose Dulce. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. Finally, Robert Hartley looked toward Jonathan Ellis. You can confirm this document is fully enforceable? I can, Jonathan replied immediately. The 2015 will is legally superseded. Effective immediately, Dulce Whitford holds controlling ownership of Whitford Properties. Margaret Coleman leaned back quietly in her chair, satisfaction flickering across her face. Richard Holloway exchanged a long glance with Susan Parker. And across the table, my father stared at me differently for the first time in 28 years. Not with embarrassment. Not with dismissal. With fear. This still proves nothing, Miranda said suddenly, her voice tight with desperation. This still doesn't prove anything. Miranda's voice had lost its polish now. The confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle and desperate. Even if the will is legitimate, she continued quickly, which we absolutely intend to challenge, Dulce has no executive experience. She cannot run this company. I'm not asking to run the company, I replied. I turned toward the board instead of toward her. I'm asking you to look honestly at the evidence. I removed the 2018 board minutes from my portfolio and placed them on the table. March 14, 2018, I said clearly. Gerald Whitford proposed Resolution 2018-2007, which would have reduced Eleanor Whitford's voting authority from 51% to 10%. I located the highlighted section and read directly from it. The founder is no longer capable of understanding modern business operations. That statement is being taken out of context, Gerald snapped immediately. The resolution failed by 2 votes, I continued over him. Eleanor's vote and Margaret Coleman's. I looked toward Margaret. Is that accurate? Margaret nodded slowly. It is. Her expression hardened slightly as she remembered. Eleanor called me after that meeting. She wasn't upset because the resolution failed. She knew it would fail. Margaret turned toward Gerald. She was devastated because her own son attempted to take away everything she built. This is ancient history, Gerald said sharply. No, I answered. It's evidence. The room fell silent again. Evidence that my grandmother was fully aware of what she was doing when she revised her will in 2019. Evidence that she understood exactly who she was protecting herself from. I paused briefly. And exactly who she was protecting. Robert Hartley folded his hands together slowly. Does anyone present have documentation contradicting the evidence Miss Whitford has provided? Silence. Gerald? My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. No response came. Miranda? My sister stared down at the polished walnut table without speaking. Richard Holloway finally broke the silence. Robert, I think legal counsel needs to review these documents immediately. Agreed. Hartley checked the time. This meeting will recess for 15 minutes. Mr. Ellis, please remain available. The board members stood almost instantly, voices dropping into urgent whispers around the room. Gerald didn't move. He remained seated beneath Ella Laner's portrait, staring upward at her painted face. For the first time, I wondered if he finally understood what she had really thought of him. 15 minutes became 45. The company's legal counsel, a narrow-faced attorney named Patterson I had never met before, spent the entire recess on the phone verifying records with Morrison and Blake, Chase private client, and the New York State courts. I sat quietly at the end of the table while the room buzzed around me. Jonathan Ellis eventually brought me a glass of water without saying anything. Margaret squeezed my shoulder gently as she passed. Across the room, Gerald and Miranda argued in low, furious whispers that became increasingly less controlled as time passed. Finally, Patterson returned. He leaned down and whispered something into Robert Hartley's ear. Hartley's expression shifted first to surprise, then to resignation. "Please take your seats," he announced. The room settled again, tense and silent. Hartley adjusted the papers in front of him carefully. "Our legal counsel has completed preliminary verification." Every eye in the room fixed on him. "The will presented by Miss Whitford is valid under New York state law. It supersedes all prior testamentary documents." Someone at the far end of the table inhaled sharply. "Effective immediately," Hartley continued, "Dulce and Whitford holds 51% ownership of Whitford properties and therefore assumes majority shareholder authority." Silence. Heavy. Absolute. Then Hartley looked directly at me. "As majority shareholder, Miss Whitford now possesses the right to introduce motions before this board, including motions concerning executive leadership." He folded his hands. "Do you wish to present any motion at this time?" I stood slowly. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my voice stayed calm. "I do." Gerald surged to his feet immediately. "Robert, this is completely absurd." "Sit down, Gerald." Hartley's interruption landed with unexpected force. "Miss Whitford has the floor." For a second, I thought my father might ignore him. Then slowly, stiffly, Gerald sat back down. His face had gone pale gray. I looked around the table at the 12 people who, less than an hour earlier, had viewed me as little more than a quiet administrative employee. Now every one of them waited for my decision. I realized then that I could destroy my father's career with a single sentence. The power was entirely mine. And suddenly, I understood why my grandmother had waited so carefully before giving it to me. Power revealed character. I thought about Ella Laner. About the letter she left behind. Not revenge. Justice. I took a breath. I am not proposing the removal of Gerald Whitford as CEO. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Miranda's head snapped upward in disbelief. Even Margaret Coleman looked surprised. "What I am proposing instead," I continued, "is a formal vote of confidence." I looked directly at the board. "The directors of Whitford Properties will determine whether Gerald Whitford still retains their trust as Chief Executive Officer." I let the words settle before continuing. "If the board votes no confidence, Gerald resigns effective immediately." Then I turned slightly toward my father. "If the board votes confidence, I will not interfere with operational leadership during my tenure as majority shareholder." "This is absurd," Miranda said sharply, rising to her feet. "You're turning a corporate proceeding into a spectacle. A revenge fantasy." "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "This is corporate governance. The same framework used in every properly run company." I let my eyes move across the room, steady now. The same framework my grandmother built into the bylaws over 40 years ago. A pause. "If my father has the board's confidence, he has nothing to worry about." Robert Hartley studied me for a long moment. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, but real. Respect, maybe. Or reassessment. Is there a second for the motion? He asked. Seconded. Margaret Coleman didn't hesitate. Hartley nodded once. Then we will proceed to vote. He looked around the table. All those in favor of expressing confidence in Gerald Whitford as CEO, raise your hands. 4 hands went up. Gerald's closest allies. Board members who had built their positions under his influence, his recommendations, his approval. Hartley nodded slowly. All those expressing no confidence. 7 hands rose. No hesitation. No ambiguity. He counted them once. Then again. Finally, he set his pen down. The motion carries 7-4, with 1 abstention. Silence pressed into the room like weight. Hartley turned toward my father. Mr. Whitford. The board has voted no confidence. In accordance with Section 14.3 of the corporate bylaws, you are required to tender your resignation within 30 days. Gerald didn't speak. He stood slowly. And for the first time in my life, he looked at me without dismissing me. Without shrinking me. Without rewriting me into something smaller. He just looked. I expected rage. I expected denial. I expected him to explode. But what I saw instead was something colder. Recognition. The realization that he had underestimated me so completely that he had lost everything. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. No shouting. No final argument. Just silence where authority used to be. I know what some of you are thinking right now. Why not fire him outright? Why give him dignity? Why not end it completely? Because revenge isn't the same thing as justice. Because breaking someone doesn't repair what they broke in you. And because my grandmother didn't raise me to be cruel. She raised me to be precise. If that resonates with you, you already know what it feels like to be underestimated. And this wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. Now, back to what happened after the boardroom emptied. Gerald caught me in the private corridor outside the boardroom doors. Priscilla was with him. Someone must have alerted her during the recess. Her face was pale and streaked, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. You, Gerald said, voice barely controlled. You ungrateful. Not here, Priscilla interrupted quickly, gripping his arm. Not here, Gerald. She just destroyed this family in front of 12 people. I stopped walking. I didn't destroy anything, I said calmly. I presented facts. Facts? Gerald let out a bitter laugh. Your grandmother was manipulated. That lawyer, Ellis. Grandma Eleanor wrote that 5 months after you tried to strip her of control, I cut in. Because she saw exactly who you were. My voice stayed steady. You didn't lose because I betrayed you. A pause. You lost because you betrayed her first. Priscilla stepped forward, her voice softening into something almost pleading. Dulce, sweetheart, you have to understand. We were trying to protect you. You've always been. Struggling? I finished for her. Silence. I shook my head slowly. You didn't protect me. You erased me. The words landed cleanly. No anger. Just truth finally spoken aloud. Every Christmas dinner. Every family photo. Every conversation where Miranda's name mattered and mine didn't. That wasn't protection. A breath. That was abandonment. That's not fair, Priscilla whispered. You're right, I said quietly. It wasn't fair. I looked at her directly. I spent 28 years trying to become someone you could finally be proud of. A pause. I'm done trying. Gerald stepped forward again. This isn't over. We'll contest the will. You'll lose, I said simply. And you already know it. His expression tightened. Grandma Eleanor planned for every contingency. Including you. I turned toward the elevator and pressed the button. Behind me, Priscilla called my name. Dulce, wait. The doors opened. I stepped inside without turning back. And for the first time in my life, I didn't wait for them to decide whether I was allowed to leave. The doors closed. I leaned against the steel wall, finally letting myself breathe. The adrenaline drained out slowly, leaving something unexpected behind. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Grief. Because what I had just done wasn't only taking control of a company. It was letting go of a lifetime of hoping they might someday choose me. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. That was the strange part. The elevator had taken me down 42 floors, but it felt like I was still somewhere between levels, caught between what I used to be and whatever I was becoming. By the time the doors opened at the lobby, I had already wiped my face dry and straightened the borrowed blazer like nothing had happened. Like something inside me hadn't just cracked open and reshaped itself. Jonathan Ellis was waiting near the security desk. That was... He began, then stopped, searching for the right word. Necessary, I said before he could finish. A pause. Your grandmother would agree, he said quietly. He fell into step beside me as I moved toward the exit. What happens now? I asked. Now? He adjusted his briefcase slightly. Now you go home. You sleep. And you try to figure out what life looks like without the version of your family you believed in, and without the role you were forced to play in this company. I nodded once. I don't want to be CEO, I said. I never did. We reached the revolving doors. The city beyond was bright, loud, indifferent. I just want the company my grandmother built to be run by people who actually care about it, I added. Not people who treat it like inherited property. Ellis gave a slow, approving nod. The board will want to meet with you soon, he said. Transition planning. Your long-term role. I know, I replied. Just not today. I stepped forward as the doors began to turn. Manhattan sunlight hit my face the moment I exited the building. Warm. Unfiltered. Real in a way the boardroom never was. Today, I thought, I don't need to be anything other than myself. Not a shareholder. Not a symbol. Not a correction to someone else's story. Just Dulce Whitford. And then, almost quietly to myself. Tomorrow can deal with itself. I glanced back at Whitford Tower. 42 floors of glass and steel carrying my family's name like it still meant something fixed and permanent. It didn't feel permanent anymore. Tomorrow, I thought, I start building something that actually belongs to me. May 19, 2024. Gerald Whitford signed his resignation letter at 4 p.m. I wasn't there when it happened. I found out through an email from Robert Hartley. Miss Whitford. Your father has tendered his resignation effective June 15, 2024. The board has appointed me interim CEO pending a formal search process. Additionally, the board has approved a new role for you, strategic advisor to the board. This position will allow you to participate in major decisions while you determine your long-term involvement with Whitford Properties. Please share your thoughts at your convenience. Robert Hartley. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it. Because my brain still expected it to change if I looked long enough. It didn't. I forwarded it to Jonathan Ellis. His reply came within the hour. Fair structure. No hidden conditions. This is clean governance. Congratulations, Dulce. That evening, the company-wide email went out. No drama. No emotion. Just corporate language doing its best to describe something seismic without acknowledging the weight of it. Effective June 15, Gerald Whitford will step down as CEO. Robert Hartley will serve as interim CEO. Dulce Whitford has been appointed strategic advisor to the board in her capacity as majority shareholder. We thank Mr. Whitford for his service. My phone started lighting up almost immediately. Old colleagues. People I had worked beside for years without ever really being seen. Now suddenly they wanted coffee, conversations, reconnections, explanations. I ignored most of them. One message, though, I didn't ignore. Patricia Morales. Executive Assistant. Company since 1987. One of the few people who had actually known my grandmother. Dulce. Eleanor used to talk about you more than anyone realizes. She always said you saw patterns others missed. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Welcome to the boardroom. She would be proud of you. I saved that message. Not because I needed validation anymore. But because some truths don't come from the people who raised you. Sometimes they come from the people who actually saw you. 1 week later, the story hit the press. Quietly at first. Then everywhere. Whitford Properties shakeup, secret 2019 will reshapes corporate control. The article never named me directly. It couldn't. Legal constraints, corporate privacy, carefully worded reporting. But anyone who understood Manhattan real estate knew exactly what had happened. In a dramatic internal restructuring, control of Whitford Properties has shifted following the discovery of a previously undisclosed testamentary document from the company's founder. Sources describe the transition as both legally binding and long overdue, citing long-standing concerns over executive leadership practices. Gerald and Priscilla canceled their appearance at the Metropolitan Museum Gala. Health reasons, their office said. No further comment. Within 48 hours, 2 major investment partners requested direct meetings. Not with the board. Not with interim leadership. With me. 2 of them stayed after those meetings and confirmed continued partnerships. One of them said something I didn't forget. Your grandmother built something rare. It's good to see it protected. And then the quiet ripple effect began. Old alliances shifted. Social invitations vanished. Business relationships quietly realigned themselves around whatever direction they believed the company was now moving. And somewhere in all of that noise, I realized something simple. Power doesn't just change who listens to you. It changes who pretends they always did. Charity invitations started disappearing quietly after that. No dramatic announcement, no confrontation, just subtle removals from lists that once seemed endless. The Whitford name still opened doors, but now there was hesitation behind them. An unspoken question attached to every invitation. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't grieve it either. It simply became part of the new landscape. On Saturday morning, Margaret Coleman called. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I stood by my apartment window, watching the city move like it always did, indifferent to personal earthquakes. I don't know yet, I admitted. Ask me in 6 months. A soft sound of approval came through the line. Fair answer. Eleanor would have said the same thing. That made me pause. She always believed in measured decisions, Margaret continued. That vote of confidence you gave your father instead of immediate removal, it was very her. I didn't think of it that way. She used to say mercy is the highest form of control, Margaret added gently. Because it means you had every option, and still chose restraint. After the call ended, I stayed still for a long time. Mercy had never felt like weakness before. Not in that context. Not anymore. It felt like ownership. Of choice. Of consequence. Of myself. June 8, 2024. At 2 p.m., my phone rang. Dulce, my mother said. Her voice was different. Smaller. Less certain. Can we talk? Just the two of us. Against every instinct built over years of disappointment, I agreed. We met in a midtown cafe, neutral ground, no family territory, no boardroom shadows. Priscilla was already seated when I arrived. She looked tired in a way makeup couldn't fix. Thank you for coming, she said quickly, as if I might leave before she finished the sentence. I sat down across from her. What do you want, Mom? Her hands tightened around her untouched cup. I want to apologize. The words landed awkwardly, like something she wasn't used to saying out loud. For everything, she continued. For how we treated you. For what we said. And what we didn't say. I watched her carefully. Are you apologizing because you're sorry? I asked, or because things changed? Her expression faltered immediately. The question didn't need repeating. Both, she admitted finally. Her voice broke slightly. And I hate that it took this to make me see it. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. I told myself we were protecting you, she said. That you couldn't handle expectations. That it was easier this way. But it wasn't protection. It was avoidance. It was selfish. I stayed quiet. You let Dad call me worthless, I said finally. In front of people. In front of everyone. And you never corrected it. Not once. I know, she whispered. And I can't undo it. Silence stretched between us. Then she looked up. I don't want to lose you completely, she said. Even if I deserve it. I studied her for a long moment, the woman who had shaped my earliest understanding of love and later abandoned it without explanation. I can't pretend none of it happened, I said carefully. But I'm willing to see if something new can exist. Something honest. Her shoulders trembled slightly as she nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. But it wasn't nothing either. August 2024. Miranda called while I was walking through Central Park. I almost didn't answer. Dulce, she said immediately, I need to see you. Please. Just once. We met near Bethesda Fountain. The summer heat pressed down heavy, the city louder than it needed to be. Miranda looked different. Not polished. Not controlled. Not untouchable. Just human. I've been in therapy, she said without hesitation. Since May. 3 times a week. That's good, I said. It's not good, she replied with a short, humorless laugh. It's painful. Turns out being the successful one isn't freedom. It's pressure you can't ever set down. She stared at the water. Everything I achieved was never enough. Not for Dad. Not for the family. It just raised the bar. I didn't interrupt. Then her voice lowered. The way they treated you. I knew it was wrong, she said. I just convinced myself it wasn't my place to fix it. You weren't protecting me, I said quietly. She nodded immediately. No. I was protecting myself. Because if I defended you, I would have become expendable too. A pause. That's not an excuse, she added. It's just the truth. I looked at her then. What do you want from me, Miranda? Nothing, she said quickly, shaking her head. I don't deserve anything from you. Her voice cracked on the last word. I just needed you to know. I see it now. I see you. And I'm sorry I didn't before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Two sisters shaped by the same house, raised in the same silence, living entirely different versions of the same childhood. I can't go back, I said finally. I know, she whispered. But I'm not interested in staying enemies either, I added. Maybe we start from somewhere new. Something real this time. Miranda wiped her eyes quickly, nodding. I'd like that, she said. And for the first time, I believed that what came next didn't have to repeat what came before. 6 months after the boardroom vote, I moved to Brooklyn Heights. A one-bedroom in a pre-war building, old enough that the floors creaked like they had stories to tell. From my window, I could see the bridge my grandmother once crossed in 1965 when she was building her first office from nothing but conviction and borrowed space. Now it crossed my view every morning. The rent was higher than anything I'd ever paid before. But for the first time, it wasn't a source of panic. Because I wasn't surviving anymore. I was stable. My role had changed too, Director of Sustainable Development at Whitford Properties. The title had been my suggestion, not theirs. A division focused on green construction, environmental impact, long-term urban responsibility. The kind of direction my grandmother would have pushed for if anyone had listened to her in time. The salary helped, $185,000 a year, plus dividends tied to my shares. But the money wasn't the point. The point was ownership. Not just of equity, but of direction. Of voice. Gerald called once a month now. Always the same rhythm, careful, restrained, almost formal. He asked about the weather. The apartment. Work. Never the boardroom. Never the past. And I let him keep it that way. Because sometimes silence isn't avoidance, it's structure. A way of surviving what can't be repaired in conversation. Priscilla and I had lunch every 2 weeks. It was still awkward. Still careful. Still full of pauses where older versions of us used to exist. But she was trying. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Just consistently. That mattered more than apologies ever had. We weren't rebuilding what we lost. We were building something that had never existed before. Honest. Uneasy. Real. Miranda and I met on weekends sometimes. Coffee shops. Quiet corners. Neutral spaces where neither of us had to perform a role. We didn't pretend the past was light. We didn't rewrite it into something kinder. We just talked. About pressure. About expectation. About the strange cages we'd both lived in, hers made of achievement, mine made of erasure. She told me what it felt like to never be allowed to fail. I told her what it felt like to never be allowed to matter. And slowly, without announcing it, we stopped treating each other like symbols. We started treating each other like people. Not healed. Not fixed. Just real. On the wall of my apartment hung my grandmother's portrait. The same one that once overlooked boardrooms and decisions I was never meant to touch. Now it hung above my quiet living room, where sunlight shifted across it in the late afternoons. Sometimes I caught myself looking at it longer than I meant to. Not for answers. Just recognition. You were right, I'd think quietly. I see it now. And in my own way, I'd imagine she'd answer the same way she always did. Not with praise. With clarity. Good. Now use it well. Looking back, I understand something I couldn't have understood at 28. My grandmother didn't leave me control because she believed I was superior. She left it because she believed I would be responsible with it. That's a different kind of faith. Dyslexia never made me lesser. It made me different in how I processed the world, slower in text, faster in pattern. Less linear, more structural. I didn't read rooms the way others did. I read systems. Relationships. Gaps. What my parents called weakness was actually perception they never trained themselves to see. Gerald measured people in credentials. Degrees. Titles. Appearances. Eleanor measured them in something harder to fake. Character. Consistency. How they treated people when there was nothing to gain. And now, finally, I understand something even simpler. I don't have to inherit either standard. I can choose my own. If there's anything this story left behind, it's not revenge. It's clarity. You don't need to be chosen by people who never learned how to see you. You don't need to win approval from systems designed without you in mind. And you don't need to burn everything down just to prove you existed. Sometimes the real shift happens quietly. When you stop asking to be included. And start building something where you already belong. That's what my grandmother left me. Not just shares. Not just power. But permission. To see clearly. To act carefully. To exist fully. And to never confuse silence for worthlessness again.